Leading up to the commencement of hostilities in what would be the largest ever invasion in all of human history, as the external invasion forces, according to fourth generation warfare doctrine, gathered in both Mexico to the south and Canada to the north like a gathering storm, they had been concealed by very powerful satellite dazing technologies to cover their movements to their jumping off points. As coalition air power now flew over American skies to neutralize all American air based threats, the external invasion prongs now, in the south central invasion sector alone, advanced on four major axes of advance deep into the heart of the nation, where they would assist Trojans that were already operating, capturing critical objectives therein. As it pertained to the external invasion prong of PLA Group Armies 1 through 6 and the 41st Russian Combined Arms Army, these very powerful forces consisted of a grand total of 372,000 personnel, with 312,000 alone being Chinese PLA ground forces troops or regular Chinese military forces. As the Chinese PLA had mobilized all of its reserve and ready reserve group armies, along with its active duty group armies, these forces would absolutely be required, as raw numbers would be needed to subdue a nation of this vast size. And only China, or China with allies, could conceivably pull off such a massive invasion, as this would be the invasion of all invasions, which would put even Operation Barbarossa to shame, as it was several times larger in terms of the ground forces used, as well as also being larger in air and naval power deployed as well. As the Russian 41st Combined Arms Army, part of this external invasion prong, would move deep inland and be shed off in the city of Lubbock, where another major supply dump would be used to allow the PLA Group Armies 1 through 6 to continue their advance to Amarillo, where they would then fan out to assist other Trojan units. These powerful forces would be key to wrapping up operations in the heart of the country. As it pertained to the Twin Cities area, where the 2nd People's Armed Police Light Armored Division, as the local Trojan unit, had been stationed, this was the ideal fighting force to capture such a critically important objective, as the Permian Basin as a whole and this Twin Cities area of Midland and Odessa held massive energy resources, as well as also metal and mineral resources, which would be vital to Chinese industry, as it was already known through intelligence gathering that there were a handful of American militias located in the area, which were known to be exceedingly well armed, as the American regime itself had tried to keep tabs on these elements. This hacked information was categorized and cataloged by the Chinese through their cyber warfare arm and their AI, and allowed them to pick choice units for certain areas, including the 2nd People's Armed Police Light Armored Division, which was picked for the campaign in the Midland and Odessa Twin Cities area. As the PAP as a whole was known as one of the most powerful paramilitary forces on Earth and in all of human history, this mighty fighting force, having had deployed its 2nd Light Armored Division to the Midland and Odessa battle space, would race headlong, fearlessly into their objectives, as they were brutally aggressive and savage in their operations, as they had years, or decades rather, of combat experience crushing armed resistance in Xinjiang and even in some cases in Tibet as well. And they would use these finely honed combat skills to brutally crush all defending forces located in the Midland and Odessa battle space. Between midnight and 12:30 a.m., or within the first 30 minutes of the invasion, there was an enormous amount of movement occurring within the Midland and Odessa battle space, as the People's Armed Police, with their various comprising combat battalions within the larger 2nd People's Armed Police Light Armored Division, were all racing to capture, destroy, and or clear different objectives located throughout the battle space. As the defending forces, as the American military and alphabet paramilitary forces, would be no match for the savagery of the People's Armed Police, as they had total air superiority, as the PLA and Iranian Air Force had contributed powerful assets to this campaign. They also had superiority in drones, IT, AI, and firepower dominance to boot, as the American militia forces, as there was a total of 7 of them in this area, had operated as a sort of loose confederation as they all kept contacts with one another and used similar procedures to obtain heavy weaponry, as these militias had wealthy businessmen and other financiers among their ranks who willingly shelled out ample sums of money to give to straw buyers to purchase heavy weapons from the Mexican cartels, who had also acquired weapons through the shady arms dealers from the Great Eastern European proxy conflict. Many of these weapons being American-made, with some foreign-made, but mostly American-made. They came from American stocks to the own detriment of the American regime, as they had depleted many of their stocks to give to the Great Eastern European proxy conflict. Some of these stocks were now equipping American militias. They ended up back in American hands, but not in the hands of the American regime. Some of these militias would actually be better equipped than the American military forces in some categories that were operating in this battle space. As a militia located in the southwest quadrant of the battle space, numbering a total personnel count of 1,250 personnel, operating from their base/headquarters area on the boundary of the Llano Escatado and the Chihuahua Desert, had essentially been casing out a suspicious property located in the middle of this rough terrain in the southwest quadrant of the map, whereupon a CCP regime property hosting the headquarters and support battalion over the entire 1st Brigade of the 2nd People's Armed Police Light Armored Division was stationed, this being a critical unit to the operations of not just the 1st Brigade of the 2nd Light Armored Division of the PAP, but as the 1st Brigade as a whole would depend on this unit for its supplies, as well as also the command structure giving orders to its comprising battalions. As this property, the CCP regime property, had been disguised as a massive factory farming operation with 4 gigantic industrial barns, as well as also a sizable office building. These barns had concealed all of the vehicles belonging to this battalion, as well as also other equipment, and beneath these gargantuan barns were multiple levels that had been excavated over the years, which contained unquantifiable amounts of supplies, including weapons and ammunition of various different types, as well as also huge stocks of fuel, MREs and other food, as well as water, and enormous amounts of spare parts for different vehicles and more. As on the eve of the invasion, if we go to the map of this area, the area in question containing the CCP regime property had already had a berm constructed around it, which had been there for years, but on the eve of the invasion, personnel from the battalion had gone out and essentially erected concertina wire fencing around the outermost perimeter of the CCP regime property. Also, select personnel coming from the 350th Battalion of the 7th Division of the National Construction and Production Corps, a different paramilitary force, had come into the area on the CCP regime property, as they did with the other headquarters and support battalion over the 2nd Brigade, and had mined the outer perimeter of the property with anti-tank mines to prevent vehicle-based attacks against the personnel thereupon. Again, this unit was absolutely critical to the operations of the entire brigade and the 2nd Division as a whole, as the 1st Brigade was half of the division. And this headquarters and support battalion was comprised of its headquarters and headquarters company, which were the command and administrative elements over the whole battalion and the whole brigade within the 2nd Division, Light Armor Division, which consisted of its propaganda/civil affairs platoon, its special support troops platoon, within which included troops like EOD troops, as well as the combat drone section, which operated the 48-tube TEL-based system, which could launch 48 loitering munitions at a time of the CH-901A variety, as well as also sniper spotter teams and others. And also their headquarters platoon, as again, this would be the third platoon of the headquarters and headquarters company, as the headquarters platoon itself contained the administrative and command elements over the whole battalion and whole division, as this contained what would be the equivalent of the S shops at the brigade level within this battalion's headquarters and headquarters company. There was also then the security company, which was the equivalent of the military police for the entire brigade. These troops were often used to guard convoys as well as critical sites, which included even Laoguys, as they were Laogai guards at times as well. There was also the brigade-level maintenance company within this battalion, and also the medical company at the brigade level, which was the medical and surgical troops, with the brigade surgeon overseeing this company, and also mortuary troops. And then there were 4 quartermaster supply logistical transport companies, which supplied all of the different combat battalions within the 1st Brigade, whose responsibility was the Odessa side of the battle space. As convoys of supplies would leave this facility at the opening of the invasion, the convoys would be used to truck supplies to the headquarters and support companies in each combat battalion, who in turn would turn around and supply their combat companies with the supplies that had been dropped off from the quartermaster supply logistical transport companies of the headquarters and support battalion in the brigade. When this map opens up, it opens up at 12:30 a.m., or 30 minutes into the invasion as a whole, by which point the attacking force of 200 militia had come in aboard everything from their technicals to their all-terrain vehicles, and others yet still had moved in on foot to be the advanced party of attacking troops who would set up their fighting positions in the rugged terrain on the hills overlooking this facility. As the surveillance apparatus of the coalition could literally see every single solitary movement on the map, it was already known that these militiamen were moving into place and bringing heavy weapons. Again, these militias had made contingency plans for assaulting this facility in the event of a grid-down scenario or any other type of national catastrophe, because there were also foreign criminal elements which were separate from the Trojan shock forces, which were making the most noise just prior to the invasion, so to speak. These criminal elements were already causing massive levels of civil unrest, and these militias morphed from community defense organizations to full-blown militias to defend against these well-armed foreign criminal entities, and now they would face head-on the largest ever invasion in all human history. As the hills overlooking the facility gave excellent lines of sight into the facility for use of different weapon systems, such as anti-tank guided missiles like this TOW system with the ITAS system on it for better target acquisition, as well as the American-made PSRL-1 rocket-propelled grenades, also AT-4s that found their way back, which was another light anti-armor weapon, a one-time use 84mm recoilless shell, as well as other American-made weapons, including machine guns of different sizes, such as the M249 Saws. There were also general-purpose machine guns, like this M60, as well as 240 Bravos, and even heavy machine guns like M250 Cals and others. There were also foreign-made weapons that were European weapons that had been gifted to the Great Eastern European Proxy Conflict by other NATO member states that also made their way into America to these militias. As they were moving into place and setting up for their assault, at this point in time, as they moved up into the hills, with many technicals deploying their squad-sized troop elements into the high terrain overlooking the facility, others would attempt to make a direct attack with support coming in from the hills in terms of their fire support to neutralize defenders on the perimeter. At this point in time, 2 companies had left the facility, bearing supplies for other combat battalions. So all that remained on the facility was the headquarters and headquarters company, the security company minus a platoon, which was ensuring security for convoys, and the medical company and two quartermaster supply logistical transport companies. The situation would evolve into a all hands on deck situation, as this facility could absolutely not afford to be overrun, as the coalition had total air superiority over the battle space. They would use this to their fullest advantage, as strike aircraft such as the Iranian Air Force Su-24s and the PLAAF or Chinese Air Force JH-7s, which were very heavy-hitting strike aircraft, would come in and pound these positions on the hilly terrain overlooking this critical facility, as the artillery of the People's Armed Police 1st Brigade was already heavily engaged with other operations and could not even be used to support the unfolding battle erupting against the headquarters and support battalion in the southwest. The artillery was primarily engaged at hitting the American military targets in the north of Odessa, which was the 106th Brigade Support Battalion, which was the main critical logistical force in this area, which came from the larger 155th Armored Brigade Combat Team, although the reserve company called up from the local area, the 877th Quartermaster Company, served as the main logistical force for the defending forces at the international airport, the Midland International Air and Spaceport. The artillery was showering the 106th Brigade Support Battalion and parts of the Alpha Company, and would end up having to shift their fire, relaying their howitzers to lay down fire on the 150th Brigade Engineering Battalion rapidly after they finished operations against the north of Odessa, as they had to support the armored battalion assaulting both the 150th Brigade Engineers as well as also the ICE detention center, which was a critically important facility for the colonization operations to follow the invasion. As this shift in fire would occur between 12:30 and 1 a.m. predominantly, the first 30 minutes involved the hitting of the north of Odessa by the PAP artillery. It would not be until after 1 a.m. that some of the comprising batteries of the artillery battalion within the 1st Brigade of the PAP's 2nd Light Armored Division could shift their fire to support the embattled headquarters and support battalion, which until that point would primarily rely on the coalition's overwhelming air power for support, as well as also its drone capabilities, largely in the form of Wing Loom 2s and 3s, as one Wing Loom 2 and two Wing Loom 3s, along with loitering munitions from the nearby Shorad Battalion of the 1st Brigade, would come in to hit the American positions on the hilly terrain overlooking the battlefield, as artillery would finally come in by 1:30 a.m. after having had already subdued the American military forces in the north of Odessa and the American military and paramilitary forces to the south of Odessa, before being able to shift fire to support the headquarters and support battalion, as well as also the assault being carried out by the armored battalion against the American armed civilians that fled to the oil reclamation plant, which was already a key objective and wanted intact, as this facility was important to cleaning oil to enable any contaminated oil to be reused. It was similar to oil recycling in some ways, as this facility was highly important to the future colonization operations in this particular region. It was wanted largely intact, and the armored battalion already being tasked with it was to clear it of these armed civilians who fled into this plant from West Odessa neighborhoods, as originally the Light Mechanized Infantry Battalion was to clear these forces on their flanks before they went and attacked. But fortunately for their operation against the American military forces in the north, this group fled to the oil reclamation plant, where the armored battalion was to assault anyhow. As the embattled headquarters battalion at the opening of the battle would see a convoy of one of its four quartermaster supply and logistical companies leaving the facility, as 2 had already left by this point. There would still be 2 remaining on the facility while it was under heavy attack. As we go to the western end of the map, within this 1.5 mile east-west by 1 mile north-south area, technicals having had come off the local roads, pulling up to the east-facing side of this hilly terrain, or on the western end of the hills, were now disembarking their squad-sized elements from their technicals, although some left their drivers and gunners, if applicable, if they had machine guns mounted in the back, to move up into the hilly terrain, as there had been, again, advanced party personnel who had already arrived on the hills first, as, again, the headquarters/base area of this sizable militia of 1,250 members was located only 2.5 miles to the slight west and south of the CCP regime property, hosting the headquarters and support battalion of the whole 1st Brigade. Flying overhead, of course, to maintain air superiority were the combat air patrols being undertaken by the highly advanced J-35A fighter jets of the PLAAF contributed to this campaign, as soon entering this battle would be the Su-24 strike aircraft, who would be the first of the coalition's air assets to hit the American positions, as a pair of Su-24s, as again throughout the entire campaign, airstrikes were happening all throughout the battle space, but a pair of Su-24s were immediately available to hit American targets on the hills. These aircraft would enter at 12:45, or just merely 40 minutes into the exchange of fire, which was already extremely heated, as the American battle plan was to take positions on the high ground and fire down and into the facility to wither down its defenses to allow for a direct attack on the facility by vehicle-mounted or technical-mounted personnel, as well as personnel on ATVs, such as RPG teams with rocket-propelled grenades, such as PSRL-1s, and also those boasting AT-4s, to ride in and assault the facility. Although they did not know that it was mined with AT mines, they planned to smash through the concertina wire and just storm and overrun this facility, which would absolutely be a dire consequence for the PAP operations as a whole. Again, this could not be permitted to occur, and the coalition air power, which included a pair of JH-7s and a pair of Su-24 strike aircraft, would come in and hit American positions hard, with thousands of pounds of air-to-ground ordnance dropped from these aircraft. By 12:50, or merely 5 minutes later, loitering munitions, a total of 48, that had been fired from the SHORAD battalion of the 1st Brigade, which was actually on the same CCP regime property as the artillery battalion was, as they were there to support and defend them from air threats, as the SHORAD battalion was armed with Type 80 vehicles, which were track-based twin 57mm cannon for air defense, as well as also the towed Type 59 57mm cannon, and also FN-6 man-portable air defense systems. This was a SHORAD force for the whole brigade, but was stationed on the same CCP regime property as the artillery battalion, and its 48-tube TEL-based loitering munition system would be utilized to support the embattled headquarters battalion, as they were under fire trying to get their system up and running. They were in the process of loading it with loitering munitions, but would never end up using it by the time the battle ended. As the battle continued, by 1 a.m., additional JH-7 strikes would come in to hit targets in this area. But for the first 15 minutes of battle, the combat was intense between the People's Armed Police personnel that were on the perimeter and the Americans that had taken to the hills surrounding this facility, laying down heavy fire with anti-tank guided missiles, such as the TOW missiles, this one with an ITAS system for better target acquisition, as well as also rocket-propelled grenade fire and AT-4 fire, and javelin fire, as there were a sizable number of javelins that made it back into the hands of Americans, but again, into the militia's hands and not into the military or government or regime's hands, which meant that there were militia forces with more anti-tank weapons than even the National Guard army troops had, who had to ration them out, as again, to America's own detriment, it depleted its supplies of ATGMs and SHORAD systems, among other weapons such as artillery shells, to the Great Eastern European proxy conflict, leaving them at a severe disadvantage for their own home defense. While this battle was underway, and RPG/AT4 teams on ATVs were also attacking the perimeter, and the main strike force was gathering to push towards the facility to attempt to overrun it with heavy firepower support from different fields of fire covering this virtually the whole facility. The PAP was in deep trouble in this operation as they tried to defend their positions along the berms. They did have potent weaponry, such as their 12.7 millimeter heavy machine guns, such as this W-85 turret-based machine gun aboard this MRAP, this Tiger MRAP. They also had their QBJ-201 light machine guns, their QBZ-95 rifles, standard issue, and their Type 69 rocket-propelled grenades. Although they had huge stocks of anti-tank guided missiles and other weapons in these industrial-sized barns, which effectively acted as warehouses and also concealed the battalion's vehicles until the start of the invasion, they would not utilize these weapons as they were earmarked for the combat troops, as they had their own stocks of weapons to utilize for self-defense. This EQ-2050 would end up being destroyed. This Tiger MRAP would end up being destroyed. And this Tiger MRAP would end up being destroyed by potent ATGM fires. Another weapon the Americans came with, which was shocking, was SHORAD capabilities in the form of a small number of Stinger missiles. Each Stinger missile that had been purchased came with 3 BCU units, or battery coolant units, which were required to fire the system. When used, the system only had a 45-second window to acquire, track, and destroy a target. And as the PAP troops on the ground would also be supported by dedicated combat drones, or UCAVs, in the form of 2 Wingloom 3s and a Wingloom 2, as there were a grand total over this whole battle space of 10 of each type, making 20 total combat drones, or UCAVs. One Wingloom 2 would be shot out of the sky after it had gotten off attacks of its own, firing 4 HJ-10 ATGMs at targets on the hills. The Wingloom 2s and 3s did have a means by which to defend themselves from SHORAD systems, as they had electronic warfare modules which could spoof the targeting of ATGMs and cause them to go off course, as they could make it appear as there was a target elsewhere to strike. But this capability could only work so well as one Wingloom 2 would be hit. Although it would spoof one of the Stingers, the other would get a hit and down this Wingloom 2 system. As loitering munitions entered at 1250, they would begin to pound personnel on the hills with fragmentation warheads. As the militiamen came in ATVs and technicals, these systems that they came in, these vehicles, were easily decimated by the loitering munitions with fragmentation warheads. While the PAP troops fought hard to defend their perimeter as it was under heavy assault from the hills, they fired everything in their possession to stop this attack. As they begun to lose personnel defending the perimeter, in some cases they would lose entire half squads as hits from RPGs, AT-4s, and ATGMs would land devastating blows on the perimeter troops as they fought to defend their facility. As again, there were a number of the security company personnel left on the facility, as again, one of their platoons had left to guard convoys that were now supplying other combat battalions, while others held and bolstered the perimeter. Most of the perimeter defenders were the non-combat quartermaster troops who were now fighting desperately to hold off this savage attack. As again, artillery would come in very last in this battle, as this battle would last from 12:30 to 1:45 a.m. The artillery only coming in by 1:30 a.m. or an hour into the battle, as again, the artillery had to be used on other priorities first. But again, the air power more than made up for this discrepancy, as the heavy-hitting JH-7s and also the very powerful Su-24s would come in and completely maul the positions on the hills with devastating air-to-ground munition strikes. As this came in at 12:45, and as these two came in at 12:45 or 15 minutes into the battle, these two Su-24 strike aircraft would each drop 10 1,000-pound air-to-ground munitions on the hillside, simply blanketing this whole hillside with air-to-ground munitions, while these technicals, totaling 5 in this prong and 10 in this prong, as each technical carried between 8 to 10 personnel, but mostly in the range of 7 to 8. And these two ATVs with RPG teams came rolling in. They would be completely and thoroughly blown into multiple pieces of scrap by 12,000 pounds of air-to-ground munitions from each JH-7, blanketing the entrance to this valley with these devastating munitions. With the Su-24s hitting the hillside and the loitering munitions entering shortly thereafter, gradually, bit by bit, the personnel on the hillsides would be eliminated by direct fire from the perimeter defenders that were trying to desperately defend their perimeter with heavy machine gun fire, general purpose machine gun fire, light machine gun fire, rifle fire, rocket-propelled grenade fire. ATGMs had and would continue for slightly longer coming in, while the real-time AI battlefield data processing system through the quadcopter assets at the vehicle crew / squad level mapped everything in real time to enable the precision strikes via the loitering munitions, the devastating air power, and the UCAV, or dedicated combat drones, now entering the scene as well. As the combat drones carried a combination of HJ-10 ATGMs as well as CM-502KG dual-purpose anti-tank, anti-ship missiles for heavier penetration, these combat drones were absolutely devastating on the ground forces, including those taking to this hilltop, wherein a bit later, by 1 a.m. or 30 minutes into the battle, another pair of JH-7s would come in and pound this area, including the command post set up by the assaulting militia forces command elements in this area, as they had 3 ATVs, 2 personnel each, to run messages from the battlefield back to the main headquarters / base area of the militia for the command elements gathered here. They would all be pounded on the hilltop and here in this valley and on this hill by precision strikes from JH-7s, as this pair came in at 1 a.m. This JH-7 would drop 8,000 pounds on the hillside and in this valley to wipe these forces out, while this JH-7 would pound this entire hilltop right here, destroying these rocket-propelled grenade teams from these ATVs that had rolled into place on the hill, as well as the personnel, squad-sized elements taking positions on these higher terrains of the hill here. They would be completely and thoroughly flattened by another 8,000 pounds of munitions, but spread out in this particular hillside. As again, there would be 3 technicals that dropped off squad-size elements. These squad-size elements had moved down and off the hill to assist the main thrust against the facility by the time this airstrike had come in. As they bounded and covered tactically, coming down the hill toward the People's Armed Police non-combat troop defenders, they were now under heavy fire from the PAP troops guarding the perimeter with everything they had available, including, again, rocket-propelled grenades, heavy machine gun fire, light machine guns, rifles, and even as these personnel bounded closer, 35 millimeter tube-fired grenades, as some of these PAP troops carried these grenade tubes beneath their QBZ-95 rifles. The fighting here was absolutely savage. There would even be snipers employed by the militiamen who would pick off some of the PAP personnel on the perimeter as combat medics would rush on scene from the medical company or the med-surg company of the headquarters battalion over the whole brigade. And these medics, these combat medics, would pull these personnel out into the ambulances, the field ambulances, while the rest continued to lay down heavy fire as they resisted along the perimeter. As these two buildings here were portable buildings that were critically important to the operation of the whole brigade, these contained the communications for their quantum communications, which were the latest and greatest in communications capabilities, their satellite-based radio and intranet communications for the coalition as they kept in contact with other forces through these particular buildings. These were of dire importance to defend for the entire battalion. This, of course, as well being the nerve center of the entire brigade's command elements, much less the battalion under assault, as the battalion administrative and command elements were within the office building that was on the CCP regime property site. And as these were effectively the nucleus of the command of the 1st Brigade of the 2nd Light Armored Division, these areas had to be defended at all costs against the attack now coming in from the American militia attackers. So loitering munitions would pound this hillside and wipe out these two squad-sized elements that were well spread out and well dug in the rough terrain. They could not avoid the attack of the loitering munitions entering the scene, which would simply wipe them completely out, just as the spread out pounding of thousands of pounds of air-to-ground ordnance from the Su-24s of the Iranian Air Force flattened American positions along the hillside to the immediate west of the facility. In the valley, the JH-7 strike wiped out all of the technicals and the two ATVs that were trying to plow through the perimeter defenses but would never quite make it to the perimeter, as the shower of air-to-ground ordnance they would receive from above would simply wipe them completely out. As the personnel on this hillside were likewise wiped out, all that remained were in the rugged terrain below, these bounding and covering squad-sized elements, and the vehicles dropped them off, trying to come around to give them support as they had their machine gunners in the back of these technicals. They would be wiped out by this Tiger MRAP and these troops guarding the southern or the southwest-facing perimeter, as well as artillery strikes that would now come in from between 1:30 and 1:45, where the battle would promptly come to an end. As these ATGM strikes from this Wing-Loon 3 had been fired at retreating forces, one on an ATV and others on foot, these would pound these forces just in their rear positions here, while the rest of the technicals that had dropped off all these foot-based personnel would be pounded and showered by 122 millimeter artillery fires coming in from the People's Armed Police firing batteries of the artillery battalion of the 1st Brigade, now able to support their heavily embattled headquarters and support battalion. The one firing battery of Type 59-I or -1 howitzers, the 130mm howitzers, slightly more powerful than the 122mm howitzers, would be firing in support of operations to capture and clear the oil reclamation facility, while there would be 5 of the 6 firing batteries of the 122mm Type 83 towed howitzers firing in support of their embattled headquarters and support battalion. As the 40 howitzers opened fire, as they had to relay their howitzers facing this direction, as they had to reshoot all their azimuths of fire to enable them to support the embattled defenders, they now were able to rain down heavy shell fire on all of the forces remaining on the hillside, as well as those in the lower terrain nestled behind the hills, relatively safe from the direct fire, as the loitering munitions that had been lobbed from the nearby Shorad battalion to aid their embattled headquarters battalion had already been used, as all 48 of them hit personnel on the hillsides, wiping these personnel completely out. The personnel of the militia that had come in on an ATV with Stinger missile launchers were able to get off 2 shots before ISR-directed artillery strikes to the real-time AI battlefield data processing system had wiped these personnel out completely just after they had gotten off 2 Stinger missiles at this Wing-Lung 2, as there was a Wing-Lung 3 here and a Wing-Lung 3 here. They would not be hit and would successfully hit personnel on the hillsides and behind the hills with their ATGM strikes, while this one, the Wing-Lung 2, had already fired an 4 HJ-10 ATGMs at targets before being wiped out by the Stinger missiles. It was able to spoof one missile and make it go off course, but the other missile got a direct hit and destroyed this UCAV, this dedicated combat drone. As the combat lasted an hour and 15 minutes, the fighting indeed was heavy, and the PAP, while suffering relatively mild losses in the overall grand scheme of things, still was impacted by this attack and would have to strengthen its security measures far more, as it expected future attacks to come from this direction now that it had been directly assaulted by the American militia that they knew was directly to the south and slightly west of their position. For the most part, all of their important supply vehicles had remained completely intact. They had not lost any of their armored ambulances. They had not lost any of their Shangji supply trucks, none of their their fall MV3 fuelers, they didn't lose their 48 tube loitering munition TEL based system. Their communications buildings that had been brought out are completely and thoroughly intact, as were all of their armored recovery vehicles and more. Essentially, all they had lost was 2 MRAPs and an EQ-2050. However, they lost the gunner, driver, and TC in these vehicles, as well as also losing dismounted personnel that were holding perimeter positions. Some of the personnel, again, being lost to well-placed AT-4, RPG, and ATGM fires that were fired down and into the facility from the hilly terrain. Before the invasion, it was not as if the coalition had a choice, as they purchased their CCP regime properties where and when available. Therefore, they had purchased this property in a disadvantageous location. However, it was still defendable because of their powerful air support and drone capabilities, which enabled them to stave off this devastating attack carried out by 200 militiamen against these coalition positions on the ground. Again, these were People's Armed Police non-combat troops. And although the PAP were vicious fighters, these non-combat troops had not anticipated that they would even engage in any combat throughout the course of this particular invasion. And now they would have their baptism of fire against the assaulting American militia forces. Again, they would have to strengthen their defenses as they would anticipate another attack, which meant that they would have to move further out and conduct potential aggressive patrolling of the hills around the facility to ensure that they would not be utilized by the militia forces again. As an immediate counterattack was to be carried out as soon as possible against the attacking militia, who still had 1,050 members remaining on the loose, so to speak, within their headquarters/base area. The armored battalion who had assaulted both the 150th Brigade Engineering Battalion of the larger 155th Armored Brigade Combat Team and aided massively in the seizure, intact mostly, of the highly coveted ICE detention facility, along with two combat companies of sappers from the 350th Battalion of the National Construction and Production Corps 7th Division. The combat companies that had not been used in the seizure of this facility, as two light tank and one armored infantry company had been committed, would be immediately committed to assist the embattled headquarters and support battalion of their brigade, only to end up arriving 15 minutes late when the battle had already come to its final conclusion. As convoys had moved out, they, on the road out to this facility, as the track-based vehicles were generally much slower than the wheel-based vehicles of the light mechanized infantry battalions of the two brigades, had passed the convoys leaving down the road en route to supply the headquarters and support companies of each combat battalion on their CCP regime properties, who again in turn would truck out supplies to the combat companies of each combat battalion. They would arrive on scene, again, 15 minutes late, as they would roll down the road in front of the facility to its south. They would stop and refuel and resupply outside of this facility and have fuel and ammunition and more trucked out to them to ensure that they were over capacity on everything they would require for a devastating counterattack that would be launched 2.5 miles away against this base area, as the remaining two light tank companies and two armored infantry companies would lead the assault against the forces in this base area coming from this armored battalion, whose other armored infantry company, one of three, and the two of four light tank companies would continue to occupy the freshly captured ICE detention center, which was to become a Laogai, along with the two combat sapper companies from the 350th. The remaining combat companies of this battalion, again, would refuel, resupply, and prepare for a major push against this sizable remaining militia force, which would occur just after 2 a.m., as they would arrive and press their assault, which would begin at 3 a.m., as they would drive slowly the 2.5 miles and fan out around this base area to get into jumping off points to attack it. It should take approximately the full hour to do all of the aforementioned. As the Wingloon 2 loss would awaken the coalition to the full realization that the American militia forces in the area had access to SHORAD capabilities, this would essentially ensure the coalition air power would fly far higher and well out of range of these systems, including the drones, which had the capability to fly at a maximum altitude of just over 5 miles in the air, which was out of range for the Stinger systems. However, the Wingloon 2, at the time flying lower to get a better attack run going for the personnel on the hill, fell prey to these systems. Now the remaining drones would carry out higher altitude operations, as would the strike aircraft, just to ensure that they would not fall prey to the devastating potential of these SHORAD systems. As 200 American combatants were wiped out by the devastating coalition air power, drone capabilities, and ultimately at the very end, artillery firepower of the PAP's own artillery assets of their artillery firing battalion, the remaining American militiamen located 2.5 miles away would need to be thoroughly destroyed to ensure that they would not be able to interfere with coalition objectives unfolding throughout the battle space, as they could potentially become a threat to the flanks of coalition forces operating in this battle space, especially now being fully aware of the potent heavy weaponry carried by this militia. And what the PAP didn't know is that the militia in their base area had even heavier weapons, surprisingly, than what had been able to be deployed against them at their CCP regime property. There would be a heavy, high-intensity battle for the clearance of their headquarters/base area of this partisan-like force, this powerfully well-armed militia force. Perhaps this being the strongest militia of all 7 militias throughout the entire battle space, although others were heavily armed as well. This militia did, in fact, possess some slightly heavier weapons than even the other militias in the area boasted. And the next video installation of this hypothetical invasion documentary series highlighting 4th generation warfare doctrines through the lens of a Sino-Russian coalition invasion. There were 2 additional major flank clearance operations unfolding beginning at 12:30 a.m. One flank clearance operation being the operation carried out by an armored battalion against a militia force in the southernmost outskirts of Odessa, as a militia had its headquarters location in this area and would need to be completely cleared out and destroyed to ensure that they could not interfere in the capture and destruction of the 150th Brigade Engineering Battalion and the adjacent ICE detention facility, which was to be taken intact. This flank clearance operation was absolutely critical to the carrying out of this objective. Another major flank clearance operation was the destruction of the militia located in the far southeast quadrant of the battle space to ensure that they could not move possibly eastward and interfere with the external invasion prongs moving up and towards Big Spring. They had to be completely and thoroughly annihilated to ensure that they could not be a threat to this massive convoy that was anticipated to arrive in Big Spring in roughly 8 hours after the initiation of hostilities. Out of all of the opening battles unfolding throughout the course of this campaign, by far the fighting that had occurred in the southwest quadrant of the battle space was the most audacious, as this militia had beat the PAP to the punch and attacked them first in this particular part of the battle space when they assaulted their headquarters and support battalion, a critical unit to the functioning of not just the 1st Brigade, but the entire 2nd PAP Light Armored Division. As the service support company of the 2nd PAP Light Armored Division, with its flying platoon of high-capacity Z-8 utility helicopters, stayed highly active in the opening stages of the invasion, as their medevac flights were a constant. The People's Armed Police were known for their extremely high level of aggression with their combat style. This, for them, produced casualties, as they were not completely reckless, but they were far more aggressive than even their PLA brethren as they rushed headlong into their assaults. Although in the case of the embattled headquarters and support battalion of the 1st Brigade, these Z-8 utility helicopters would fly in to pick up the KIA and WIA non-combat troops as they had staved off a withering assault against their compound. The PAP would lose 31 troops as KIAs, and they would lose an additional 44 as WIAs, but these numbers were spread throughout the companies of the battalion located on this forward operating base, which was the 6 of 8 total companies that were on the forward operating base at the opening of the invasion, while the other 2 had left to carry out supply operations. They would lose 2 Tiger MRAPs, and they would lose an EQ-2050 up-armored combat vehicle. These being lost to ATGMs and rocket-propelled grenade strikes into the facility, carried out by the militia forces. But the militia would end up losing heavily, as all of the attackers of this bold and again very audacious assault would be completely and thoroughly destroyed by the real-time AI battlefield data processing system putting together pre-prepared strike packages for the coalition air, drone, and artillery assets, which completely and thoroughly liquidated all of the attacking forces. Again, the PAP would learn from this disaster that had been staved off and would begin to carry out aggressive patrols in the hills around their installation and would push out some defenses a bit further from the current perimeter. As now, the 350th Battalion of the 7th Division of the National Production and Construction Corps, upon having had completed its forward operating base construction operations on the soon-to-be mega FOB of the Midland International Air and Spaceport, would be able to send one of its civil engineering companies to build up their headquarters installation a bit further, pushing out the perimeter and strengthening the defenses around the area. As again, even after the invasion would end, it would be anticipated that there would be anti-partisan operations to continue to maintain security in the recently conquered territories. And therefore, critical supply bases would have to be bolstered, as the headquarters and support battalions, CCP regime property, would remain a critical supply and command installation, even into the occupation, and therefore would have to be strengthened and bolstered further. As partisan forces, after militias had been crushed, would reconstitute, rearm, retrain, and reintroduce guerrilla-style assaults against the occupation forces, who would, in turn, have to not only repel these forces, but make earnest attempts to hunt them down and destroy them wherever they were found. More to come in the next video.